Good afternoon. My name's Daniel Jacobs. We're here this afternoon for a stakeholder feedback session on Second Substitute House Bill 1701, which is on leasing liquor premises. Today's session we've got scheduled from 1 to 3 o'clock this afternoon. This is recorded, and we're going to be covering the same content on Thursday, June the 11th from 10 a.m. to noon. My name's Daniel Jacobs. I'm a policy and rules coordinator here at the Liquor Cannabis Board, and let's get started. So the objective today is to get public feedback on draft rule language implementing Second Substitute House Bill 1701 on leasing liquor premises. I'll be plugging the rules inbox if you have any questions during or after this presentation. Contact us at rules@lcb.wa.gov. Just want a few notes to keep in mind for this session. So both sessions, as I talked about, we've got one today going on right now as I speak, and then on Thursday from 10 to noon. Both of them are recorded and are subject to public disclosure. Purpose of the recordings is to make sure that we collect all feedback. We're also going to be posting these recordings on the rules webpage so that those who cannot attend are able to watch later on. This PowerPoint presentation will also be posted on the rules webpage following the second session. While the Teams chat feature is off, written questions can be submitted before, during, or after the sessions, and they can be sent to the rules inbox, which I've mentioned already, rules@lcb.wa.gov. Only the presenters are going to have their microphones on during the session. So if folks have questions, please use the raise hand icon on Teams. If you use your raise hand icon, we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. If after you've asked your question, by chance, you either leave the hand raised, which sometimes happens, or if you're still unmuted and there's background noise, we will mute you and then lower your hand for you. This isn't meant as any sort of disrespect, but we've got to keep things going. And then, as I said, to ask questions during the session's Q&A time, like I said, participants have to use the raise hand function, and you'll be unmuted and then able to ask your question. So just a review of the rulemaking timeline. So we're at the stakeholder engagement sessions right now, stakeholder feedback session. The legislation that we're talking about, which is Second Substitute House Bill 1701, actually goes into effect this Thursday. We filed the CR 101 on April 13th, 2026. We filed that pursuant to our delegated authority by the board, where because of the volume of rulemaking work that our team currently has, we've been delegated authority to begin rulemaking on implementing legislation, which means where we aren't really given a choice, we have to do rulemaking on the topic. The board's decided we don't need to bring that to them for a vote to kick off rulemaking. So that's exactly what we did. Assuming that the stakeholder engagement today and Thursday go well, we tentatively are scheduled to go to the next stage on July 1st, which is to file proposed draft rules. If there's something where we get a large volume of feedback that, hey, the draft rules we've got are off mark or don't address a topic or are confusing or something, then all these dates are subject to change, which is why I've highlighted tentative for each of them. But if we get feedback that's like, we're on the right track, we've done a good job, then I will be requesting approval of the CR 102 at the July 1st board meeting. If that gets approved, then there's what's called a public comment period from July 1st until August 12th, where the proposed rules are posted on our website and published by the code revisor, and individuals have the opportunity to look at them and submit written feedback up until August 12th. And that's because on August 12th, we're going to be doing a public hearing where we're going to have a public opportunity for folks to come and give their in-person or virtual testimony about what they think about the proposed draft rule language. Assuming that goes well, then the final rules will be requested for approval during the board's September 2nd board meeting, which would have us on target to have the rules in effect October 3rd. If again, between July 1st and August 12th, the feedback we get is, hey, these rules are confusing or don't address the right topic or are that we need to do more work, then all these dates are subject to revision. I'll just pause here and see if there are any questions about this. All right, doesn't look like there are, so we'll keep going. So the rulemaking goals. Our goals in this rulemaking are to implement second substitute House Bill 1701 and create consistency with existing sections of Title 314 WAC, which is our liquor regulations. So just a brief overview. I'm not going over all the text of 1701. If you're watching this or coming to this, I assume that you've read the legislation. If you haven't, I encourage you to do so, because otherwise it's going to be kind of confusing what we're talking about. It allows liquor licensees to lease real or personal property to other liquor licensees. And if you're like, again, I didn't know that they couldn't already do that, I encourage you to read the legislation. That really explains the context for all of this. It also allows liquor licensees to lease the use of the kitchen space to somebody else. That includes non-liquor licensees. We'll get into that in a little bit. It states that the board can require submission of these leases. And lastly, it allows breweries, distilleries, and wineries to operate in a separate space as a retail licensee, but on the same premises. And again, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I posted links in the PowerPoint to the actual legislation itself and to our draft rule language, which we're just about to jump into. I'll pause here and just see if there are any questions before we get going. I should also say at the outset that I'm recovering from a little bit of a cough. So if I pause for water breaks or if I cough or something, that's what's going on. So we have one new rule that we're proposing to create at 314.02.006. It's called liquor licensee leases. We're proposing to amend two existing rules on 314.07.020, which is the liquor licensee qualifications and application process, and prohibited practices, contract, gifts, rebates, etc. So just jumping into the new rule, 314.02.006 sub 1, we're creating definitions where we talk about the lease, a lessee, and a lessor. These are terms that just talk about the parties to a lease. If you're a person who is leasing something from someone else, so let me just to use an example, this is what we're talking about, but you lease a car. I'm leasing a car. I'm the lessee because I'm leasing the car from the car dealership. The car dealership or the finance company or whatever it is the lessor. These are terms that are also used we borrowed these definitions from RCW 62A, which is also known as the Uniform Commercial Code. It's a general law that governs contracts and, in this case, leases. Frankly, we copied their definition because at the LCB, we didn't have a definition for lessee and lessor in our rules. And if there's already a definition that exists somewhere else in Washington law, I would rather copy that than remake the wheel. Where we're talking about a person, we're making this definition a little broader than what exists in RCW, because our RCW definition, I guess, doesn't include LLCs. Also, as mentioned a little bit later, the legislation doesn't strictly limit it to licensees. So in theory, a liquor licensee can lease space to a non-liquor licensee. So it wouldn't make sense to only talk about licensees. And then lastly, separate space. And that refers to the topic that I mentioned earlier, where distilleries, wineries, and breweries can lease a separate space on their premises to a retail licensee. The legislation doesn't define what separate space means. And so we're proposing a definition that says that means areas separated by physical barriers. If you're like, what's a physical barrier? It can be a wall. It can be a fence. If you have other questions about what it can be, send them to us. But we didn't want to limit it to walls. We didn't want to the topic of what counts as a sufficient barrier is explored in other areas of liquor rule, and frankly, that's a different topic. And so that's the definition that we're working with here. Pause to see if there are any questions before I go on. All right, seeing none, let's keep going. So, consistent with RCW 66240113C, and to explain, 6624.01013 is the section that's created by 1701. I also don't know if I've explicitly said this for anyone watching, but I'm reading based off of the PowerPoint presentation, so I'm hoping that folks will follow along if they're watching this later or able to see the PowerPoint. Because if you're not, again, not going to make a lot of sense. But anyways, so consistent with the RCW, all lease agreements, operating agreements, and other contracts in existence between licensees, businesses, and the lessor, as we talked about before, so the lessor is the car dealership, and between lessors and lessees, and amongst lessees, must be submitted to the board. So the RCW says, hey, if you're going to do this, that's fine, but you got to submit the leases, or the legislation says that the board can require you to submit the leases. And we are taking that, we've been given that authority to do so. And so we're saying, yeah, you should submit that to us. Additionally, we're also saying that all agreements and contracts need to be, that they're described in this subsection, also have to be kept and maintained consistent with WAC 314.11.095. And WAC 314.11.095 is the record keeping regulation. So basically what we're saying is, listen, if all the stuff that you have to submit to the board, you also have to keep a copy of it yourself. I'm hoping that in the course of business, if you probably already are doing that, if you're submitting somebody to the board, if something's important enough that you got to submit it to us, I assume you're probably going to keep a copy of it for yourself. If not, you probably should. Not try to give you advice, but probably not a bad idea. But even if that wasn't your practice, we're saying it is now, because now we're requiring it in rule. Before we continue here, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions. And again, if you have questions, feel free to use the raise hand function on Teams. All right, seeing none, we're going to go on to the next section. So kitchen space. So this is just about leasing kitchen space. And we're doing a whole separate section on this because there's been other rulemaking on kitchen space and food service requirements. And so we want to address this specifically. So lease of kitchen space, a lessor. So again, and going back to the analogy of, and throughout this presentation, I'm just going to use the analogy of you're leasing a car from a car dealership. So the lessor, the dealership that leases use of its kitchen to a lessee, me leasing the car, has to comply with the following. So the lessor has to make sure that the lessee holds all required state and local businesses before operating out of the kitchen. This actually comes straight from the legislation. So this is required in RCW. We're just reiterating that here. B, licensees have to maintain separate secure storage of their alcohol inventory when leasing kitchen space. So we're shifting from talking about what lessors and lessees have to do to licensees, because now what we're saying is, listen, you're a liquor licensee and you're leasing your kitchen space to somebody else. Let's say you're a liquor licensee and you're leasing your kitchen space to another liquor licensee. You have to make sure that your liquor supply is secure. However you do that, we're not going to get into. And this is consistent with other rules where we have folks sharing space, liquor licensees sharing space with other liquor licensees or non-liquor licensees. We're just saying, lock up your liquor, or don't lock it up, do something to secure it. And whether you're leasing your kitchen space to somebody who also has a liquor license, or perhaps maybe more importantly to somebody who doesn't have a liquor license. But either way, you also, if you don't keep your liquor in the kitchen at all, then, still lock up your liquor. C, a licensee may lease out their kitchen space, but they can't contract out their food service unless either One, the licensee doesn't have a food service requirement, or as permitted in WAC 314.02.015, 314.02035, or 314.02045. And this is referencing rulemaking that just completed on 1602, from last year's session. What we're basically saying is, yes, you're leasing out the kitchen space, but this isn't the same thing as the contract kitchens rulemaking. This isn't leasing out your requirement to make food. So this isn't the same thing as using a food truck to fulfill your food service requirement. This is you're leasing out the space where the kitchen is. If you want to contract out your food service, you can do that, but that's per a different set of rulemaking. So that's what we're trying to make clear here, that these are not the same things. If you could comply with both within complying with both sets of rules, great, more power to you. But we want to make clear that leasing out the kitchen space itself isn't necessarily the same thing as contracting out your food service. I know that's that might be a little confusing. So I'll just pause here, see if there are any questions on this topic. All right. And again, if you realize later on tonight or this afternoon that you're like, oh, Daniel said this thing and it made sense at the time, but later I was thinking about it, it actually doesn't make sense, feel free to shoot us an email, the rules inbox, rules@lcb.wa.gov. Or if you want, you can come back to we're going to be doing this all over again on Thursday, July 11th from 10 to noon. You can come back then and ask the question then. So going on to the next slide.
Daniel, I just wanted to chime in real quick. And you said July 11th and you meant June 11th.
That's right. Thanks, Tierney. Thank you for catching that. That is correct. I meant June 11th. I meant this Thursday. Don't come July 11th. That will be too late. And also, I won't be having a stakeholder engagement on July 11th. So, yeah. So going back, lease requirements generally. So all leases under this section have to comply with the following. So one, leases can't contain any profit or revenue sharing. That comes straight from the legislation itself. So we're not making anything new here. Leases can't require that the lessee, so the person leasing the car, serve products made by the dealership, the lessor. That's also straight from the legislation. Leases shall not require that the lessee advertise products made by the lessor. So that's not actually strictly in the RCW, but we think it follows pretty logically from B. That listen, if we're not trying to have a tied house situation or some situation where in order to lease space from a licensee, you have to advertise their products. The law already says you can't be required to sell their product. Seems like being required to promote their product is, sort of along the same topic. And then lastly, leases shall not require any activity prohibited by WAC 314.12.140, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, or other sections of Title 314 WAC. It might seem obvious that a lease can't contain something that requires you to break the law, but just in case it isn't, lease can't require you to do something illegal. I'll just pause here, see if there are any questions on that. All right, seeing none, I'll go on to the next one. So this is the last part of our new rule, which is saying, so nothing in this rule allows licensees to share space beyond what's already permitted in RCW 6624.1472, 6624.710, Section 7, and 6624.800. So these are just sections of RCW that allow you to share space. So this is sort of talking about what we had said earlier, which is that there are statutes and rules that let licensees share space with other licensees. That's not what this is about. This is about a licensee leasing space to somebody else or leasing part of the premises to somebody else, and they both can keep operating, but they're not in the same space. They're in separate spaces. And this is also similarly comes from the law itself, saying this isn't an expansion of shared space, except when it comes to the kitchen, or actually except when it comes to the kitchen. And there's some ways that you can share the kitchen space, but like we talked about with the kitchen rule, that doesn't mean you can contract out your food service. So before we move on, I just want to pause and just see if there are any questions. If you have questions you want to submit in writing instead, feel free to send an email to the rules inbox, rules@lcb.wa.gov. All right. Moving on. So this is where we're talking about adding language to existing rules. So I made a handy little table here. So we've got three sort of pieces of language that we add to some of these rules. So where we say that licensees are permitted to engage in leases consistent with RCW 6624/01013, RCW 6628/295, Section 16, and our new WAC. So this is saying, hey, you're allowed to participate in leases consistent with 1701, this rulemaking. We're adding that to both 314/07/020, excuse me, and 314/12/140. Excuse me. Now, these two pieces, these two clauses, sentences, these actually relate to rulemaking of 1602. And we're adding those to 314/07/020 along with this one. Now, to be clear, this isn't related to our rulemaking. These two are related to the 1602 rulemaking. But when we were looking at these two rules, we realized that actually we should be adding language on it to 314/07/020. I'll pause here just to see if there are any questions. All right, seeing none, that's actually it. Again, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll be able to talk about next steps. Is there any topic that we already went over that anybody wants me to go back to? Because we're very efficient with our time. So if there's any topic that anyone wants us to go back to, I can do that. All right, seeing none, we'll talk about next steps. So next steps is that we're going to collect the feedback that we got in this section and during this session and the one on Thursday. Going to meet with the project team and hopefully proceed to the CR 102 stage. I'll just do a last call for questions. And again, this recording will be posted on the LCB's webpage. This PowerPoint will be posted. We're going to be doing the same presentation on Thursday, this Thursday, June 11th at 10 a.m. Any final thoughts? Any last questions or concerns? All right, hearing none, I'm going to call this good. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Again, if there are any questions, please feel free to email us, rules@lcb.wa.gov. Thanks so much.